Louis Beckett had always been a man of quiet precision. He wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, and had never seen the need to impose his presence on the world. He preferred to let time do the talking and let stillness speak where words fell short. After retiring from a long and patient career as a lecturer in art history at a modest Midwestern college, Louis sought a life not of escape, but of restoration. His diagnosis, one of those strange, hard-to-pronounce neuromuscular disorders that causes unpredictable balance failures and muscle weakness, had slowly redefined the architecture of his days. Though not immediately visible to the untrained eye, the disability was very real. Some days he needed the support of a cane. Other days he used a foldable mobility scooter for longer distances. And on rare good days, he walked without assistance, though never quickly. It was not inconsistency. It was the cruel irony of variability that came with the condition. He moved into his new neighborhood in early autumn, a cul-de-sac community nestled just outside a mid-sized city. It was quiet, clean, and unremarkably affluent, exactly the kind of place where people valued privacy, curb appeal, and low-stakes conversations about garbage pickup schedules and hedges growing too enthusiastically. Louis liked that, or rather, he thought he would. He had no desire to become involved in the social fabric of the neighborhood. No holiday lights competition, no front porch wine parties, no community garden, just space, just silence, just the comfort of knowing that his home was his own. But silence, he learned, is a fragile illusion in a place where watchfulness replaces friendliness, and where someone's absence from community events is interpreted not as a preference, but as a deviation. She introduced herself within the first week. Karen Miller. Stout, commanding, eternally dressed in floral prints stretched to their limits, and possessed of that special kind of confidence that only comes from never once questioning one's own correctness. She walked directly up to him while he was unloading groceries from the back seat of his car, taking a bit longer than usual as he was fatigued from walking across the large grocery store, and offered him one of those smiles that was more performative than warm. She asked if he needed help, and when he declined with polite gratitude, she squinted at him and lingered for just one beat too long. He chalked it up to over-friendliness, the kind that didn't know how to accept "no thank you" as an answer. But then, during a neighborhood gathering he didn't attend, a comment was reportedly made about that man with the cane who sometimes jogs to his mailbox. Louis didn't jog. He never jogged. And he never walked fast to the mailbox. He sometimes stepped out without his cane if the symptoms were mild, especially when the weather was good. But perception was reality for people like Karen, and the reality she was crafting didn't include nuance. It was binary. You were disabled or you weren't. If you didn't look the part every second of every day, then your claim was questionable. Things began to escalate in ways that weren't obvious at first. He noticed more lingering stares. Conversations around him abruptly stopped when he approached. A man who lived 2 houses down, previously cordial, now avoided eye contact entirely. His recycling bin was knocked over 3 times in a week, and though he initially dismissed it as wind or coincidence, the angle and position of the bin said otherwise. And then there was the incident at the pharmacy, a place where he went every month to refill his prescriptions. He had chosen to take the electric scooter that day because the muscle spasms in his legs had been particularly severe that morning. As he navigated the parking lot slowly and carefully, Karen, who had apparently parked just a few spots away, stepped out of her SUV and called out, voice shrill with condescension disguised as casual observation, "Oh, look at that. Some days he's paralyzed, and other days he's racing folks to the register." People turned. A few laughed awkwardly. A few looked away. Louis said nothing. He simply got back into his car and left, hands trembling with the kind of anger that's too deep to be expressed in a single outburst. The worst came 2 weeks later. A letter from the State Disability Office. It stated that a third-party complaint had been submitted regarding the validity of his benefits. The wording was sterile. neutral, bureaucratic, but the implication wasn't. Someone had questioned the authenticity of his condition, triggering a formal review. He sat at his kitchen table, the envelope in his hands, reading it over and over again, not because he didn't understand it, but because he couldn't quite believe it. It wasn't just an annoyance. It was an existential insult. It was the suggestion that everything he had been enduring, everything he had had to adapt his life around, was a lie. And, of course, it wasn't just a coincidence. That week, he received another anonymous note, this one printed crudely on a home printer, slipped through the slot of his front door without postage. "Some of us actually work for a living," it read. "The rest of us carry the weight of leeches." Lewis folded the paper slowly and methodically, and placed it in a file he had just begun to keep, a file labeled Karen. It wasn't legally sound, perhaps. It wasn't strategic in a formal sense. But it was a line, a decision, an acknowledgement that this wasn't just irritation or neighborly misunderstanding anymore. This was targeted, malicious harassment. He didn't go to social media. He didn't send a long email blast or launch a GoFundMe or stand at a podium to speak his truth. That wasn't his way. He was a man of process. So instead, he made a call. Then another, and another. He reached out to the Disability Advocacy Office at the university where he had worked, and they connected him with a pro bono legal organization that specialized in disability rights and harassment cases. Then he reached out to the local municipal office, not to lodge a complaint but to understand the boundaries of local ordinance regarding community behavior, private property, and false accusations. Then he contacted a personal attorney, not for court, not yet, but to prepare. Preparation was everything. Because this wasn't about convincing Karen. It was about ensuring that when her next step came, and it would, he would not be scrambling for footing. He would be standing already, with foundation under him, unshakable and ready. She had underestimated him. She had seen someone quiet and alone, and decided that meant weak. But Louis Beckett had spent a lifetime teaching students how to see the world through art, through subtlety, through texture. He knew better than anyone that power was not always loud, and strength was not always obvious. And when it came to preserving his dignity, he would not be gentle. Not this time. The following week settled into a strange rhythm of surface calm and undercurrent tension. On the outside, nothing appeared to change. The streets remained quiet, driveways orderly, lawns evenly mowed. Children still rode scooters past his window in the early evening, and the occasional jogger puffed by in the golden light of sunset. Yet, for Louis Beckett, every step outside became an act of psychological preparation. He'd begun to notice the subtle choreography of avoidance. How neighbors who once nodded now looked down at their phones as he passed. How Karen's group of walk-and-chat regulars consistently changed routes to cross his side of the street. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was manufactured distance, the kind of social frost that is never accidental in small, structured communities. The notes, however, were not subtle. The second one came in a different font, printed on smoother paper, slipped again through the mail slot sometime between dusk and dawn. "You're not the only one being watched," it read without signature. The implication was unmistakable. What started as mockery had become surveillance. Louis's life, which had once been defined by measured solitude and routine, was now littered with forced decisions. He changed the way he walked to the mailbox, only during midday when visibility was high. He installed motion sensor lights over the front entry and back porch. He no longer answered the door unless the visitor was prearranged. And, perhaps most painfully, he had to rethink how and when to use his mobility aids. The freedom he once found in selectively using his scooter or cane, depending on the severity of his condition on any given day, was now a liability. Each choice, a potential bullet in the chamber of someone else's narrative. Invisibility, once a comfort, was now a cage. Karen's behavior shifted, becoming more emboldened and performative. She began speaking louder when near his property line, usually while on the phone, but always within earshot of where she presumed he might be. "We've all had enough of people gaming the system," she said once, voice clear and cutting as she pruned her hydrangeas with loud, deliberate snips. Another time, during a street cleaning day, she called across the cul-de-sac to another neighbor. "You'd be amazed what people claim as a disability these days. Standing straight one day, limping the next, like magic." The neighbor laughed nervously. Louis, standing just inside his screen door, listened in silence. He had long stopped giving her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. But the tipping point, the moment everything pivoted from discomfort into full confrontation, arrived as it often does. Not with a bang, but through the mail. An envelope, official in appearance but unfamiliar in its seal, arrived with his name typed cleanly on the front. Inside was a letter from the State Department of Benefits and Social Protection. The tone was perfunctory, laced with bureaucratic indifference, but the message was seismic. A formal inquiry had been opened into the legitimacy of his disability designation. It stated that the department had received an anonymous report raising concerns about the consistency of his physical behavior and public activity. The phrase, "potential abuse of state resources," burned on the page like a personal slur. He sat still in his kitchen for nearly an hour after reading it, his coffee untouched and long since cold, the letter spread in front of him like a criminal indictment. Louis wasn't just angry, he was gutted. The letter wasn't an accusation, not officially, but it was worse in some ways. It was an insinuation institutionalized, a seed of doubt given formal soil in which to grow, and it was based, as far as he could tell, on perception alone. Not fact, not medical reality. Just the fragmented observations of someone who had already decided what to believe and was now bending the world to match that belief. He knew exactly where the complaint had come from. Karen had never made her intent subtle. She wore her righteousness like a badge, sharpened into a weapon by her sense of moral superiority, but knowing and proving are oceans apart. What Karen had done was more insidious than slander. It was strategic. By making an anonymous report, she triggered a system that would now begin turning its wheels slowly and impersonally, forcing Louis to validate, justify, and relive every step of a process that had already taken years of specialists, tests, and humiliation to confirm. The idea that someone could cast doubt with a few sentences, undoing years of hard-won legitimacy, was not only terrifying, it was infuriating. He did not scream. He did not write a scathing post. He got up, walked with effort to his desk, and began to prepare. His first call was to the legal contact he had previously spoken to, a careful woman named Marissa Caldwell, whose specialty was disability protection cases. Her voice, steady and calm, brought a momentary relief to the chaos in his chest. She confirmed what he feared. This was serious. The department had the right to review his case based on the complaint. He would need to submit documentation again, possibly undergo another assessment. And yes, technically the accuser's identity would be protected by law unless it became part of a larger legal proceeding. Louis thanked her, asked a dozen precise questions, and then began the long, methodical process of building a response. He ordered updated copies of his medical records. He contacted his neurologist for a formal letter of reaffirmation. He reached out to a therapist to confirm the psychological impact of chronic illness and social hostility. And then he began documenting everything. He kept a daily log of his symptoms, his limitations, and the variance in his condition. He took timed photos of himself with and without aid depending on severity. Not for the benefit of others, but because truth, he realized, must now be proved visually, mechanically, and without room for interpretation. His word apparently was no longer enough. It was during this time that the neighborhood committee, the informal council that had no legal authority but every ounce of social power, sent out a flyer about Community Harmony Week. It was filled with pastel clip art, invitation to potlucks, and talk of openness and honesty among neighbors. Lewis read it twice before realizing that it wasn't just an event. It was a mask. It was a social conditioning tactic, couched in language of friendliness but aimed at those who had become too difficult, too different, too non-compliant with the invisible social norms. He marked the date on his calendar. He would not attend. But Karen was not done. Her next move was almost laughably transparent. A neighborhood survey, unofficial but distributed to every mailbox, appeared one morning. It asked vague but leading questions. Do you feel that all residents are upholding the integrity of the community? Should disability benefits be reevaluated for transparency? Have you witnessed activity inconsistent with claimed medical limitations? It was unsigned, unattributed, but the design was unmistakably hers. Overly bold fonts, clip art borders, and loaded phrasing. Lewis didn't respond, but he documented it. Every word, every line. Marissa urged him not to react publicly. She wants escalation, she warned. She wants you to lash out so she can become the victim. Lewis understood. He would not give Karen the performance she craved. What he would give her instead was a legal 1-2 punch of such deliberate clarity that she would never again mistake quiet for weakness. She had taken aim at the most sacred part of his life, his dignity, and in doing so she had exposed her own intentions to a system that, when properly engaged, could do far more damage than she ever expected. He didn't want revenge. He wanted recognition, validation, the affirmation that he was not the liar she claimed, not the fraud she whispered about, not the villain of her fantasy crusade, but he also wanted something more. He wanted protection, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might one day be silently, privately torn apart by someone like her, because what Karen didn't understand, and what Louis was just beginning to truly grasp, was that her actions weren't just cruel. They were dangerous. And dangerous people, no matter how loudly they declare their innocence, must be stopped. The storm didn't arrive in one violent rush, but in the creeping, calculated manner of someone who had long ago decided how the game would be played. For Louis Beckett, it began on a rainy Tuesday morning when he opened his front door to retrieve the local circular only to find something else tucked beneath it, an official-looking envelope. The kind printed on heavy stock with the state insignia in. The corner and the unmistakable stamp of bureaucracy that made your stomach tighten before you even read the contents. It was from the Department of State Welfare Fraud Prevention Unit. The letter was not accusatory on its face, but bore that sterile, cryptic tone government communications often took when they were hedging their legal bets. It read that Lewis was requested to appear for a preliminary review of his disability designation. Requested, of course, being a polite euphemism for mandated. The review was framed as standard protocol, but anyone who had dealt with state systems knew that nothing was standard without prompting. He would need to bring medical documentation, current mobility assessments, and be prepared to speak to a board representative. The implication was clear. Someone had gone beyond submitting an anonymous tip. They had initiated a process that could affect his financial and medical stability. That night, Lewis couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to suppress the growing sense of claustrophobia building within him. He hadn't done anything wrong. There was nothing to hide. And yet, the very fact that he was now being made to defend his physical limitations, to quantify his pain and justify his struggles, planted a seed of doubt, not in the legitimacy of his claim, but in the very nature of how the world saw people like him. This wasn't about proof. This was about perception. If someone wanted to destroy you, they didn't need to catch you in a lie. They only needed to suggest that your truth looked suspicious. And if enough people nodded along, that suspicion became belief. A few days later, just before he was scheduled to meet with his legal advisor and prepare for the review, Another ripple hit. This time, it was less official, but no less destabilizing. He returned from the pharmacy, where he had endured a tense, extended wait in the lobby after his usual prescription was flagged for verification, to find 2 squad cars parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac. The lights weren't flashing, but the presence was unmistakable. One officer was talking to Karen in her driveway, notepad out, and the other was walking toward Louis's property. Louis froze. He hadn't called anyone. There hadn't been an incident. But as the officer approached, he lifted his hand in a calm, non-threatening gesture and asked, "Mr. Beckett, we received a report regarding suspicious behavior and potential surveillance activity involving a drone over this block. Your address was mentioned." For a moment, Louis simply blinked at him, genuinely struggling to process the absurdity. A drone? He didn't own one. He never had. His hands trembled slightly as he explained this, and the officer, to his credit, remained composed and respectful. "It's probably a misunderstanding," he said, "but we're required to follow up on all reports." Louis nodded slowly, heart pounding, and invited him to verify that no such device existed. He even offered to show receipts for recent technology purchases, an act that felt humiliating in its transparency, but necessary nonetheless. When the officer left, he stopped by Karen's driveway again, and Louis watched from behind his curtain as they spoke briefly before the officer returned to his car. Karen's expression was one of calm self-assurance, as though she had merely fulfilled a civic duty and was now awaiting the gratitude of her neighbors. Louis felt something sour rise in his chest, not just anger, but a deep, corrosive fatigue. He had expected resistance, but this level of pettiness masquerading as moral vigilance was exhausting in ways even his physical symptoms could not compare to. It was becoming clear that this was not about truth, or even about a personal grudge. This was about power. Karen wanted him shamed, isolated, and forced into submission, not for anything he had done, but for what he represented: deviation, ambiguity, and a refusal to conform to the visual and behavioral expectations she projected onto others. Marissa, his lawyer, responded to these developments with the kind of focused energy that only experienced professionals possess. She began building a timeline, consolidating all the events, from the notes and neighborhood gossip to the official complaint, the welfare review, and now the false report to law enforcement. She advised Louis to install a discreet outdoor security system, not to catch anyone, but to document his own comings and goings. "You need to control the narrative," she said. "You don't fight pettiness with pettiness. You fight it with precision." Louis followed her advice. He also began logging his symptoms more meticulously, cataloging fluctuations in strength, coordination, and fatigue levels, alongside corresponding weather patterns and sleep quality. If they wanted a picture of his life, he would give them a damn gallery. The next blow came from an unexpected direction. A neighbor, someone Louis had spoken to only in passing, appeared at his door one morning holding a manila envelope. He looked uncomfortable, eyes darting toward the street as he handed it over. "You should see this," he said. I didn't know how far she was taking it. Inside were copies of flyers, low-resolution printouts with grainy photos taken from what must have been a distance, showing Louis in various states. Walking slowly without a cane on a good day, seated on a bench in the park, reading, using his scooter near the grocery store. The caption beneath each photo read, "Inconsistent. Decide for yourself. Is this how real disability looks?" At the bottom of the page, in tiny font, "Submitted anonymously, for the good of the community." The implication was not just cruel, it was strategic. Karen was crafting a visual dossier designed to make neighbors question what they saw, to introduce suspicion under the guise of inquiry. It was propaganda, plain and simple, and it was working. Louis thanked the neighbor, who left quickly and without further comment, and added the materials to his file. That evening, he and Marissa met again. She was grim but resolute. "This has moved beyond slander," she said. "This is now targeted harassment. It's time we escalate." Within the next week, Marissa filed a formal cease and desist letter against Karen, citing defamation, harassment, and violation of Lewis's right to privacy. She also submitted a motion to begin a civil suit in the event of continued hostilities. Karen, unsurprisingly, responded with a performative calm. She denied everything, claimed she had merely shared concerns voiced by others, and framed herself as a responsible citizen looking out for public integrity. But the tone of her interactions changed. She no longer shouted across the lawn. She no longer sent out flyers. What replaced it was a colder, more calculated hostility, one that worked through whispers, anonymous complaints, and subtle acts of sabotage. A week later, Louis's garbage cans were pushed into the middle of the street overnight. The neighborhood board received an anonymous letter accusing him of improper yard maintenance, despite his lawn being perfectly trimmed by a service he'd hired regularly. And perhaps most disturbingly, someone began leaving small stones at the base of his front steps. Neatly arranged, circular patterns, always 3 stones. It wasn't threatening on its face, but it was repetitive, deliberate, and unsettling in its quiet insistence. Louis responded not with retaliation, but with further documentation. Every incident was photographed, time-stamped, and submitted to Marissa. She, in turn, began coordinating with a private investigator who specialized in neighbor disputes. Discreet, ethical, legally sound observation designed to gather context without provocation. The goal was not entrapment. It was exposure. As this slow-burning war unfolded, Lewis began to understand something fundamental. Not just about Karen, but about people like her. They didn't crave truth. They craved control, and when someone stepped outside the unspoken rules of conformity, whether through disability, difference, or defiance, that control felt threatened. Karen's campaign against him wasn't about belief. It was about forcing submission, about ensuring that no one could quietly resist the invisible standards she imposed. But Louis had never been interested in rebellion. He had simply wanted to live. And now, having been dragged into battle, he would not retreat. Because beneath his quiet exterior, there was a core made not of passivity, but of principle. And he would defend it, not with noise, not with vengeance, but with truth, strategy, and the unshakable calm of a man who had already endured far worse and emerged intact. The turning point came not with an explosive confrontation or a legal declaration, but in a muted office where beige walls dulled the light and voices stayed just below conversation level. A government building designed to be as unremarkable as possible, as if to quietly suppress emotion by design. Louis sat opposite a middle-aged civil review officer whose nameplate read Garrett M. Deems, a man whose expression had been carved into neutrality by decades of regulated decisions. The desk between them was clutter-free except for a laptop, a small stack of files, and a box of tissues Louis hoped he wouldn't need. It was, officially, a review hearing, an interview to verify the legitimacy of his long-established disability status. Unofficially, it was a test, a quiet cross-examination built on suspicion rather than evidence, triggered by a faceless report whose language Louis could practically hear in Karen's voice. Inconsistent use of mobility aids. Suspicious. Improvement. Citing, walking unassisted. Every phrase carried the weight of insinuation without the burden of accountability. Deems was professional, courteous even, but clinical in his tone. He asked Lewis about his daily activities, about the nature of his condition, about fluctuations in symptoms. Louis answered without hesitation, without embellishment, each word measured yet firm. He spoke of the diagnostic process, the years of uncertainty before finally being given a name for the invisible hand that routinely disrupted his balance and dulled the strength in his legs. He explained that there were days he could move freely, and others when stairs felt like mountains. He laid out how pain wasn't always dramatic, and weakness didn't always announce itself. At one point, he showed photographs, ones he had taken over the past weeks, documenting his physical state. Days with the cane, days without, mornings when he needed help to get out of bed. He had resisted the idea of reducing his life to visuals, to snapshots curated for validation. But now he understood. If the world demanded proof, he would provide it on his own terms. Deems nodded, said little, typed much. When it was over, he informed Louis that the department would deliberate and provide a written decision within 2 weeks. Louis left the office feeling neither relief nor triumph, just a hollow tiredness, as though he'd run a marathon where the finish line offered no prize, only the right to keep standing. It was the next morning that the psychological whiplash struck. At 7 a.m., a knock sounded at his door, not aggressive, but firm, deliberate. When he opened it, a tall man in his 40s stood on the porch, well-dressed in a corporate neutral suit, badge clipped to his jacket, and an envelope in his hand. He introduced himself as Richard Halverson, a legal representative for the local residential board, and delivered a formal letter outlining a neighbor-initiated request for a behavioral conduct evaluation, citing patterns of aggression, evasive, communication, and community disruption. Louis stared at the document in disbelief. This was no longer about disability. Karen had moved the goalposts again. Now she was painting him as socially unstable. A threat not because of what he did, but because of how he made others feel. It was character assassination through suggestion, dressed up in procedural language. The request, while non-binding, was positioned to give weight to future actions. Access restrictions, limitations on voting in neighborhood decisions, and in extreme cases, recommendation of legal displacement for incompatibility with the residential ethos. The wording made Louis laugh aloud, but the sound held no joy. Later that day, Marissa reviewed the document and sighed, the sound more exasperated than surprised. "She's pushing for institutional backing," she said, trying to cloak harassment in administrative neutrality, but the pattern is too consistent. We can respond, formally and preemptively, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Louis nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand the real terrain of this battle. It wasn't about the truth. It was about pressure, about how much discomfort a person could be subjected to before they gave in, conceded, moved away. It was a form of psychological siege. That night, a package arrived. No sender, no return label. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, was a plastic Halloween mask, a grinning caricature of a man in a wheelchair, grotesque and cheaply made. Tucked beneath it, a sticky note in red ink. "Take a boo. Your performance is Oscar-worthy." Louis held the mask in his hands, feeling its lightness, its insult. For a moment, he wanted to throw it, to crush it underfoot. Instead, he placed it on his desk, stared at it under the soft lamplight, and made a quiet vow to remember this moment. Not as defeat, but as confirmation. Confirmation that what he was fighting wasn't imaginary. It was systemic, cultural, and cruel. But it could be fought. And it could be won. In the following days, unexpected support began to surface, like small cracks in the polished veneer of community consensus. A neighbor, a woman in her 60s who tended to her roses every morning, paused one day as Louis passed. She didn't speak at first, just gave him a nod of solidarity, but the next day she left a sealed note on his porch. "I see what they're doing. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. If you need a witness, I'll testify." Another man, younger, who lived 2 doors down, offered to help install additional cameras after seeing some weird movement near Louis's back gate one night. These gestures were small but significant. They meant the illusion of Karen's majority was cracking. People were watching, not all to judge, some to support. And then came the unexpected shift, the mid-battle twist that reoriented everything. Marissa received a tip from someone she'd worked with years ago, now working quietly in a municipal department. Anonymously, they provided her with a copy of a formal complaint Karen had previously filed in a separate community years prior. It was strikingly similar, accusing a single resident of disruptive malingering, faking illness, and creating disharmony. The complaint had resulted in a minor lawsuit, which Karen had settled privately. It had never gone to trial. It wasn't legally disqualifying, but it was a pattern, and patterns, when proven, changed everything. With this information, Marissa updated their legal strategy. It wasn't just defense now, it was counteraction. They weren't going to wait for the next letter or the next trick. They would take the battle forward, and not in vengeance but in clear, methodical assertion of rights long trampled. Lewis didn't feel like a warrior. He didn't want the title, but for the first time in months, he felt a strange, quiet strength. A sense that even if he hadn't chosen this war, he could still decide how it ended, and it would not end in silence. The pressure, once ambient and suggestive, had now solidified into something unmistakably deliberate. Karen had exhausted the subtler strategies, insinuation, gossip, planted doubts, and having failed to silence or displace Louis through social coercion, she moved into overt procedural warfare. It began with a formal complaint submitted to the town zoning authority, alleging that modifications made to Louis' property, specifically the ramp extension leading from his porch to the sidewalk, violated local setback codes. The ramp, installed legally and approved years prior through a disability accommodation waiver, had never been questioned before. But Karen's complaint cleverly cited recent changes to ordinance language regarding temporary structures, framing the ramp as a removable fixture rather than a permanent modification. The allegation was baseless, but it was enough to trigger an automatic inspection. Louis was notified that a municipal inspector would be arriving within 7 days to assess the property and verify compliance. The implication was clear. His disability accommodations were now under public review, treated as suspect rather than necessary. Marissa, ever strategic, responded immediately by drafting a letter to the zoning board preemptively reasserting the legal foundation for the modifications, including copies of permits, medical documentation, and reference to federal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Still, Louis felt the quiet dread of knowing that his physical limitations were no longer private matters. They were subjects of communal adjudication, debated and measured by those who neither understood nor cared about the weight of living inside a body that didn't always obey. When the inspector arrived, a young man named Foster with apologetic eyes and clipboard in hand, he was polite and professional, but Louis could tell he had read the complaint thoroughly. There was a moment, as they stood near the base of the ramp, when Foster hesitated before asking, "Do you use this every day?" The question was clinical, but to Louis it felt like a demand for proof in real time. Another forced performance to satisfy. A system weaponized by the petty. The ramp was deemed compliant. The complaint was dismissed. But Karen wasn't deterred. Days later, Louis received another notice, this time from the community's insurance underwriter, informing him that a risk flag had been raised against his property. According to the report, there were potential mobility hazards and insufficient lighting that might result in reduced coverage eligibility. Again, the claim was traced back to an anonymous tip, though everyone knew the source. Louis walked the perimeter of his home that evening, inspecting every light fixture, every pathway. Everything was exactly as it should be, but the knowledge that someone had surveilled him, inspected his home with the intention of causing harm, turned every shadow into suspicion. He found himself flinching at routine sounds, waking at odd hours, checking locks twice instead of once. Even his dog, an aging Labrador named Marley, seemed to sense the shift, sticking close to him in the evenings and growling softly when strangers passed near the gate. And then, one night near midnight, The line was crossed entirely. Louis was jolted awake by a loud metallic crash. He stumbled out of bed and made his way to the front door, heart pounding. Outside, under the dim glare of the porch light, he found his trash bins overturned, contents scattered, and next to them, a jagged wooden sign driven into the lawn. It had been hastily painted with red spray paint. No more lies. We watch. The crude brush strokes were uneven, angry, almost frantic. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a threat. He called the police. Officers came, took a report, and filed it under property damage with malicious intent. They couldn't prove who had done it. No cameras had caught the act. No fingerprints were recovered. But when Louis showed them the sign and explained the context, one of the officers gave a subtle shake of the head and said, "She's got people scared." That kind of hate doesn't start overnight. The next morning, Louis found a folded pamphlet tucked into the handle of his gate. It was from a local civic integrity group, a fringe watchdog organization known for anti-welfare rhetoric and loosely affiliated with regional political provocateurs. The pamphlet detailed alleged cases of disability fraud in the county, all presented without names but filled with leading language and photographs blurred just enough to avoid legal challenge. One of the images, though obscured, was unmistakably Louis, him at the pharmacy, unassisted, mid-step toward his car. The inclusion was no accident. Someone had fed them the material. Karen, or someone acting under her influence, had expanded the war beyond neighborhood boundaries, had invited external agitators into a conflict that was already spiraling. Marissa was livid. "This isn't just harassment anymore," she said. "It's coordinated defamation. We're filing for injunctive relief. I'm not waiting for them to push you into a fall just to claim you were never hurt to begin with." In parallel, another front emerged. Karen filed a formal request to the local mediation board asking for Louis to attend a conflict resolution session, citing community disharmony and personal grievance. She claimed she simply wanted to clear the air and rebuild neighborly trust. But the timing, just days after the vandalism, the threats, and the pamphlet, made the ploy obvious. It was a trap, designed to bait Louis into appearing unreasonable if he refused or defensive if he accepted. Marissa advised against attending. "This isn't reconciliation," she said. "It's entrapment with tea and cookies." Instead, Louis drafted a statement of his own, a measured, precise outline of the campaign he had endured, with timestamps, evidence, and legal citations. It was submitted to the board directly, bypassing the performance Karen had hoped to orchestrate. And still, the harassment didn't stop. Louis's prescriptions were delayed again, this time due to a discrepancy in insurance documentation. His pharmacy apologized profusely, but noted that someone had apparently called claiming to be a caregiver, requesting information. When Louis demanded further investigation, they flagged the account and restricted access, but the damage was done. It was a breach of trust, one that required him to now lock down his medical information under security protocols usually reserved for high-risk patients. At the same time, another anonymous letter arrived. This one wasn't threatening in tone, but deeply violating in content. It listed details about Louis's past addresses, old academic publications, even the name of a therapist he had seen over a decade ago. It was a reminder. Someone had dug into his life. And now they were using the intimacy of his history as ammunition. He doubled the surveillance around his home. He installed lighting, motion sensors, secure fencing. He contacted a data privacy consultant who scrubbed his online presence, locked down public records, and warned him that anything left in the open was fair game in a world where humiliation was a tactic. And through it all, he kept breathing, kept walking, even on the bad days, kept recording, and kept pressing forward with a lawsuit that was now no longer just about harassment, but about defamation, breach of privacy, targeted psychological abuse, and civil conspiracy to displace. One night, as he sat on the back steps watching the trees sway in the moonlight, Lewis realized something profound. They hadn't destroyed him. They had transformed him. In trying to strip him of identity, of credibility, of security, they had forged something unshakable. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was a man fighting with purpose on behalf of those who couldn't, for those who had already been driven out, and for the versions of himself, tired, doubting, ashamed, that had once believed silence was safer. Karen had started this war thinking he would retreat, but instead he had built a wall of truth, brick by careful brick, and behind it stood a man not afraid to be seen, not despite his disability, but precisely because of it. The courtroom was neither grand nor intimidating, just a modest rectangular space with pale walls, rows of wooden benches, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting that created an atmosphere more bureaucratic than dramatic. And yet, as Louis sat beside Marissa at the plaintiff's table, there was a weight in the air that no architectural blandness could diminish. It was the weight of months of being watched, accused, undermined, and quietly vilified, all under the guise of community concern. Karen sat across from him in a tailored suit that looked like it hadn't been worn in years, the fabric too, tight at the shoulders and wrinkled near the elbows. Her expression was what she likely believed to be composed, but her eyes gave her away. Alert, darting, tense in a way that betrayed expectation. She was used to control, used to shaping perception, and the courtroom did not bend to perception. It bent to evidence. The judge, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the calm demeanor of someone who had heard every excuse under the sun, called the session to order. What followed was not chaos or shouting or theatrics, but a slow, deliberate unpacking of truth, layer by documented layer. Marissa began her opening statement with a clarity that held the room in a quiet grip. She didn't speak of vengeance or suffering, but of pattern. She outlined the sequence of events, not with emotion, but with precision. The notes, the complaints, the inspections, the surveillance, the threats, the anonymous flyers. And then, with a shift in tone so subtle it was barely noticeable, she said, "What my client endured was not simply a disagreement between neighbors. It was a calculated, prolonged attempt to discredit and isolate a person living with a recognized medical condition, an attempt that escalated into systemic harassment, weaponized bureaucracy, and public defamation." Her words did not rise in volume, but they struck with force, and even the judge paused briefly before nodding to proceed. Over the next hours, evidence was presented with the unyielding rhythm of accumulated fact. Surveillance footage showed Karen and her acquaintances approaching Louis' gate at night, planting objects. Handwriting experts matched her writing style to the notes. A digital forensics analyst traced the IP address of the anonymous pamphlet submissions to a device registered in her household. Witnesses were called. Neighbors who had once stayed silent, now taking the stand one by one to describe the things they saw and chose at the time to ignore. Whispered warnings about Louis, encouragement to question his condition, suggestions that someone should step in before we have another fraud case. The defense, Karen's hastily assembled team, attempted to reframe her actions as civic responsibility, motivated by discrepancies in what she observed. But her arguments cracked the moment Marissa presented the civil complaint Karen had filed in her previous community, unearthed and certified, revealing nearly identical accusations against another disabled neighbor. The judge allowed its inclusion as evidence of behavioral pattern, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted palpably, from curiosity to conviction. Karen's composure began to erode, subtly at first. She sat stiffer, blinked more often, occasionally whispered too sharply to her attorney. When she was called to testify, her voice was controlled, but her answers began to falter under cross-examination. Marissa didn't push her into confession. She didn't need to. She simply asked, calmly, repeatedly, why Karen had sent anonymous materials to third-party groups, why she had photographed Lewis without consent, and why her complaints mirrored language from a past incident she denied remembering. Karen stammered, claimed coincidence, claimed public duty, claimed confusion. But her voice no longer commanded authority. It had begun to plead. The final piece of evidence was not a document or photograph, but a person. Louis himself. Marissa advised against it initially. "You don't owe anyone your pain," she said. But Lewis disagreed. He didn't want pity. He wanted the truth to stand without filter. So, when he was called to the stand, he walked slowly, deliberately, without the cane. His condition that day allowed it, though each step cost him more than he let show. He sat down, placed his hands flat on the table in front of him, and when the judge asked him to speak, he did. Not about suffering, but about silence. He told the court what it was like to be watched, to be doubted for standing too straight on the wrong day, to fear the walk to the mailbox because your gait might be held against you. He described the choice between moving without a cane and being called a fraud, or using one and being viewed as weak. He explained the weight of always calculating how others would interpret your body, as if your pain were public property, up for vote. He didn't cry. He didn't accuse. He simply described, and in doing so, he dismantled the narrative Karen had spent months constructing. When he finished, the courtroom was silent, not out of reverence, but out of recognition. The truth, spoken plainly, needs no amplification. The judge took a brief recess before returning with her decision. In firm, unequivocal language, she ruled in favor of Louis Beckett. Karen Miller was found liable for harassment, defamation, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She was ordered to pay damages, issue a formal written apology, and complete a community rehabilitation course focusing on disability rights and bias training. Furthermore, the court referred the matter for potential criminal review based on the evidence of malicious misrepresentation and coordinated defamatory efforts. The words hit Karen like falling bricks. She didn't cry or collapse. She just sat back, slowly, her face flushed, no longer in control of the narrative. Louis didn't smile. He didn't exhale triumphantly. He simply stood, nodded to the judge, and walked out, each step unhurried, painful perhaps, but fully his own. Outside, the air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in soft, forgiving shafts. Marissa joined him a moment later. "It's over," she said. Louis nodded. "No," he replied. "It's not over, but it's no longer hidden." And in that, there was peace. The aftermath did not arrive as a triumphant celebration or cathartic release, but rather as a long, slow exhale that settled over the neighborhood like a shift in weather. For weeks following the verdict, the community wore a strange, collective quiet. No one spoke of the case directly, at least not within earshot of Louis, but he could feel the change in the way people looked at him. Less with suspicion, more with the uneasy reverence people often reserve for someone they'd misjudged. The mail carriers no longer dropped off letters with hurried glances at his porch. The man across the street, who had once crossed to avoid eye contact, now offered a stiff nod each morning. Children still rode their bikes past his house, but they didn't shout or linger the way they once had. The energy had shifted, not into warmth, but into acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is the highest form of reparation a place like this can offer. Karen disappeared from public view almost entirely. Her social circle, the same group of neighborhood busybodies that once reinforced her narrative, collapsed inward, retreating into long silences and tight-lipped expressions at block events. She ceased attending meetings, her name was quietly removed from mailing lists, and her presence became something of a phantom in the landscape of the cul-de-sac. Her house, once decorated seasonally with flags and wreaths and signs about supporting local causes, now stood bare, shutters closed most days, as though signaling a kind of self-imposed exile. It was rumored that she had put the property up for sale, though no official signs appeared. Whether she stayed or left became irrelevant. Her power, once so casually exerted over others through suggestion and insinuation, had evaporated the moment truth was held up in the light of scrutiny. Louis did not gloat. He did not speak of her or the case unless asked, and even then, he offered only brief, direct comments, never veering into bitterness or reflection. There was no satisfaction in recounting the ordeal, only a quiet certainty that what had been necessary had also been just. Instead, he turned his energy elsewhere, not out of obligation, but because the act of reclaiming space, both physical and emotional, demanded more than simply surviving harassment. It required rebuilding something deeper, a sense of safety, agency, and continuity. He began hosting small gatherings, nothing elaborate, just morning coffees on his porch with neighbors who had expressed support during the trial or afterward. Some brought pastries, others simply conversation. For many of them, it was their first real interaction with Louis that wasn't mediated by rumor or distance. They discovered a man who spoke with care, who listened more than he talked, who knew about architecture, literature, and music, and who had a dry wit that emerged at unexpected moments. He never brought up what had happened, but in those shared silences and newly formed connections, something unspoken healed. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Helen, brought over a pie one afternoon with a note that read, "You made this place safer for people like me, too. Thank you." Louis read it 3 times before placing it in the file drawer with the legal records, where it rested not as evidence, but as a reminder of why it had mattered. His home, once a point of scrutiny, became a point of pride. He updated the ramp, not because it needed repair, but because he wanted it to reflect resilience rather than controversy. He installed a small garden box beside it, filled with lavender and creeping thyme, and neighbors often commented on how it softened the edges of the yard. He resumed his long-postponed writing projects, returning to essays he had begun years ago on public space, access, and visibility. He published a piece under his own name in a respected online journal, titled The Geometry of Dignity, in which he reflected, without naming anyone, on the quiet violence of being questioned for one's body, and the healing power of visible truth. Marissa, ever the professional, continued to check in periodically, though her tone had shifted from that of a legal shield to a distant friend. They met once for lunch at a small cafe on the edge of the town. She said very little about the next steps, other than confirming the financial settlement had cleared and the public record of the case would remain accessible. "Some battles," she said over coffee, "are worth being public." Louis agreed. They talked briefly about future risks, copycats, other neighborhoods, the fragility of change, but neither spoke in alarmist terms. The world, they both knew, did not pivot on one verdict, but sometimes it tilts just enough to shift the light. In the late weeks of summer, Louis opened a discreet letter-writing circle through the local library, an informal support space for residents dealing with neighbor disputes, disability discrimination, or social isolation. He didn't advertise it widely, nor did he attach his name prominently, but word spread. People came. Some were elderly and overwhelmed by changes in HOA policies. Others were young, disabled, and afraid of what exposure meant in small towns. Louis didn't solve their problems. He listened. He handed them the tools he'd used. He reminded them that silence was a choice, not a refuge. And more than once he told someone, "You don't have to prove pain to deserve peace." In the end, the story did not conclude with a singular act of redemption or dramatic closure. Karen did not issue a tearful apology in public. The community did not suddenly transform into a bastion of progress. But for the first time in a long time, Louis felt a continuity between his interior life and the world around him. He could walk to his mailbox without calculating his gait. He could attend a council meeting and be greeted by name rather than rumor. And he could sleep at night without triple-checking locks, without flinching at every rustle in the dark. This was not victory in the cinematic sense. It was not grand. It was not loud. It was survival refined into sovereignty. And for Louis Beckett, that was enough.